Welcome to my YouTube channel, Rick Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the link in the lower right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. If you want to find out more information about my videos, self-paced courses, and live online classes and workshops, be sure to click the Learning Center link at the end of this video. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting, Pepper Pots. The photograph on the right was a reference for this painting. It wasn't my intention to copy the photograph, but rather make it my own interpretation. I decided to simplify some of the areas. I eliminated some things. I was drawn to the large white shape that was created by the pots that ran into the concrete curb it's sitting on. I didn't want the pot on the right to be as dark as that is. I didn't want it to be a black pot, so I changed that a little bit. And if you look at the foliage, I've simplified the leaves. I haven't tried to paint every leaf. I haven't tried to render every element of the photograph. Before I begin, I'll do a quick review of the colors that I used to accomplish this painting. Hansa yellow, quinacridone burnt orange, quinacridone gold, pyrrole red, rose madder quinacridone, royal blue, cobalt blue, and sap green. I also want to mention that I'm working on a quarter sheet of watercolor paper. It's 11 inches by 15 inches, and I'm working on a 140-pound cold press lanaquarel. And my paper is taped to a sheet of gator board with masking tape, and my board is at about a 20-degree angle. That's how I like to paint when I'm working with watercolor. I'm going to begin by mixing some Hansa yellow, some sap green, and some quinacridone gold on my palette. I use a porcelain palette. They have fairly large mixing areas. I'm mixing a pretty good sized pool of color. I like to set my palette up when I paint. I don't want to keep having to mix as I go. I want to have that paint ready when I'm ready to apply it. So I'll mix a variety of colors on my palette before I start to take it to the paper. And I am working on wet on dry. I'm using a soft wash brush right now. It's a jumbo round. It's a silver black velvet jumbo round small is what it's called. So this is a synthetic squirrel. And I'm just trying to define the larger shape that's made up by the foliage in these pepper pots. I'm not picking out individual leaves right now, and I really won't to a great extent. I'm going to work with larger shapes, and I'll start to define some edges that will start to represent leaves. I'll make some brush strokes that represent some of the leaves on this pot of hot peppers. I've added a little quinacridone burnt orange to my mixture. So I started wet on dry, but as I go, some of the brushwork I'm doing will actually be on wet paper, saturated paper. So it has a gloss to it. It's very wet. And normally when I'm making a wash, I don't want to try and keep it one color. And I also want to be aware of the color temperature, so I'll work with warm and I'll work with cool colors as my painting develops. And I'm pretty much working in a middle value right now. I'm putting out a middle value wash. And in the end, my composition is going to lean towards a large white shape with a middle value shape and small areas of dark value. So as I paint this, I'm painting around. If you look at my reference photo, it's a small version of it in the top right corner, but there's some strings that are tying the plant to the stakes that are stuck in these pots holding up the pepper plants. And I'm just painting around some of those because I'm going to leave just a touch of those showing. And if you look across the wash that I've put down, you can see there's some gold tones, orangey burnt sienna-like tones with a quinacridone burnt orange and some green. But it's primarily warm. There's just a hint of a cooler green maybe in the middle of that wash right by where I was just blotting. And I'll work some darker, cooler greens in as I go. I like to blot with a tissue to soften edges. I'm trying to be somewhat expressive with these brush strokes. This is not an attempt to render each leaf by any means. And I haven't done really much in the way of negative painting yet, but I will. As this develops, I'll paint around some of these shapes a little bit to help define some of the edges. I'm continuing to work that wash across the page. This is one continuous wash. There's 3 different potted plants here and lots of different leaves, but I'm painting it all right now as one shape. Now I'm going to mix a violet tone on my palette. I'm going to use some cobalt blue, and I'm going to use some rose madder quinacridone. Actually, I put a little bit of royal blue in this too. So you can see I start to get a violet. It's kind of a red violet. I'm going to add just a little bit of quinacridone gold, and actually I'm taking some raw sienna, which wasn't a color that I mentioned earlier. Use a little bit of raw sienna in this. I want to mix that into some of that violet to gray it down a little bit so it's not as raw of a violet. I'm going to start painting some of these shapes, some of these areas that are behind the pepper plants. So it's still not overly dark. It's a dark middle value at this point. As I put this wash down, I'm going to vary the color a little bit. I'm going to pick up some of that quinacridone burnt orange and some warmer tones. I'll start to mix that in, a little quinacridone gold to contrast the violet that I have there. I always try to work with warm and cool. Here I'm bringing that wash down to the side of this pot on the left and stopping right where it hits where that ledge is that the plants are sitting on. And now I'm going to work on the other side in between these 2 pots. I'm going to get a little darker here, and I'm going to keep using both the warm and cool tones. This dark mixture is a combination of the quinacridone burnt orange and the royal blue. And I continue to move across the page, and here I'm gradating from the violet into this kind of warmer tone here, which has some burnt orange in it, some gold. And the value's not shifting a lot, just changing the color. You don't necessarily change value every time you change color. And this is a light middle value. I'm going to carry this wash over onto this container. It's actually a plastic container in the photograph, and it's a dark black plastic. But I really don't want that, so I'm going to just continue to use some of the tones that I've been using and make it kind of a gray violet type color. But I've let that shadowed area just go right into the wash that I'm putting on this container, and it'll just let those kind of blend together. So I'm linking those shapes. You can see a little bit more of the royal blue in it. So to get that kind of a gray violet, I've just worked with mixtures of the blues I'm working with some rose madder, and then I've added a little bit of quinacridone gold, gone the other side of the color wheel to neutralize that some. Now I'm going to take a warmer mixture here and go back into the shadows. And once again, I'm just going to let that the edges kind of blend with what I've painted on that container. And they're close in value, but there's a shift in color temperature. And I just want that to kind of get lost in that value that's in the shadows that I've painted behind it. And as I paint this, a lot of times I'll say it's a warm tone or a cool tone. I'm sticking with a very finite group of paints here that I'm working with, the ones that I listed. And so I'm working with blues and the rose madder or the quinacridone rose madder or the pyro red and the quinacridone burnt orange and the quinacridone gold, and then working with the royal blue and some cobalt blue from time to time. But I'm using that small set of colors and just different ratios as I paint this. So when I say I'm painting with a warm tone, I'm using one that has a greater influence of the quinacridone orange or the quinacridone gold, or perhaps a little more red in it. I mean, if I'm working with the cooler ones and the violets, it's got a little bit more of the blue in the mixture, but it's that very small subset. So I know sometimes people want to hear every time you paint an area exactly what you're using, and sometimes I'll just say warm and cool, but it's this just small set of paints that I'm using. It's just a few colors. It's just I'm changing the ratio as I mix those. That's also one of the reasons why I try to shy away from when people get too particular about names of paints on tube. I prefer to go to the color wheel and refer to the color as a violet or blue violet, a red violet, a red orange, a yellow green. You can get too lost in the tube names of paint, and you should really start to get a better understanding of the color wheel. Some of these colors that I'm putting down here, this small set of colors that I'm using, I can mix these same colors using other colors on my palette and I could get the same result. My goal is to say that I want a violet tone, or I want a kind of a warm sienna tone with a gray down a little bit, but I can get there a number of ways. So I'm just painting the shadow, and I'm putting some reflection of warm light into the cooler tone that I'm putting down. So throughout, I try to mingle the colors and contrast warm against cool. Here I'm using this kind of a gray violet middle value, and I'm trying to use this to help contour the vertical plane here and give the feeling that we've just gone around the edge of this kind of concrete ledge that these are sitting on, and now these shadows that I'm painting, they're on a vertical plane. So just trying to contour that flat surface to help describe the vertical plane in this composition. Here I'm continuing to describe this shadow, this middle value, kind of a light middle value shadow I'm putting in here right now. Continuing to use that to describe the plane, in this vertical plane as it goes across. I'm going to, there's a bit of a shadow being caused by some linear element, could be a pole or a stick, and it goes up that vertical plane, then bends around and lays on the horizontal plane. So that little bit of a shadow helps describe the vertical and the horizontal planes. I'm going to use some of the same mixtures here to paint the shadows that are being cast on this planter or this pot. Kind of a white plastic pot, it looks like. So still using this grade violet. There's a shadow being cast down the side of this planter, so I'm going to bring this kind of violet tone down the edge of it. I'm going to soften that with some water. Now this concrete that this series of planters are sitting on, I guess it could be a concrete wall, has kind of a curved corner on the edge, a curved edge. So it's not real definitive, and it's all a bright white. And I'm going to just give a suggestion. I'm not going to create a hard edge there, but I'm just putting a little bit of that violet tone, a little bit of the warmer mixture that's got some quinacridone burnt orange in it. I'm going to spray that with a bottle downwards. So that's going to create a vertical movement of this paint, which is going to help suggest that vertical plane of the wall without really doing a whole lot to it. I'm not putting a sharp edge, just making it look like there's that roll to the wall where it shifts from a horizontal to a vertical, and then with this tone just kind of coming down vertically on the page once I spray it, it just helps define the vertical plane of that wall. Now I'm going to start to mix up some paint in my palette using sap green, royal blue, pyro red. So here you can see that's a cooler green mixture that I have there. I'm going to add some red to it to move it a little bit towards neutral and warm it up a little. But it's still a pretty dark earthy green that's leaning towards the cool side. I'm going to take a mixture here that's a little brighter, put a little quinacridone gold in that sap green, and a little hands of yellow to make a bright green. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to define a little bit more what's going on in the foliage of the composition. So I'm going to start to introduce some darker values. I'm going to start to introduce some smaller shapes, harder edges. I haven't made any attempt to really render individual leaves. I'm not going to do a lot of that. I'm just going to help define edges that give the suggestion of leaves, foliage of this that are coming down, kind of hanging on these pepper plants. This is going to get very repetitive, so I'm going to speed this up and I'll continue to talk as this is going. I'm going to use these mixtures that I have on my palette of green and green gold and some actually some kind of burnt sienna tones there. But I'm going to start to define these edges. I'm going to start to separate the background from the foreground. And I don't want it to be as busy everywhere in this shape that I have here. So I have this kind of a large wash that I put down early on that described the shape that was formed by all these overlapping leaves from the three planters. And I don't want to have the same degree of detail and activity across the whole shape. I want to have some areas that are less descriptive, don't draw the viewer in as much, because if it gets too busy, then the areas start to compete with one another and the viewer really doesn't know where you want them to go. And I want to lead the viewer more in through this white shape up to these bright white pots to the left here, and that one to the right is a little subdued. It's not going to stand out as much as these other ones. It's not going to have as much contrast. And as I was putting the wash on that kind of plastic planner, I intentionally didn't make it a dark black because I didn't want to draw you in there. I just let it kind of fade into the background. So I'm also going to take a similar approach in the foliage, the leaves above that planner. I'm going to play it down a little bit. I'm not going to have this level of detail and value contrast that I have going here to the left. And you can see that I'm putting in. So I don't just paint leaves. I paint around leaf shapes to help describe them. And I have lost and found edges, I have soft edges, I have hard edges. So it's a combination. And there's negative painting and there's positive painting. I'm going off of negative and positive edges here of the leaves. The other thing is some of the green washes I'm using are leaning more towards a cooler green, and some are leaning towards a warmer green. Some have a little bit more, has some gold or red in them. Trying to get variation in the colors that I'm putting down. And little by little, the painting starts to develop. You start to get greater areas of contrast. And hopefully you can see how there's much more activity on the left than there is on the right. Although I'll be going back into the right side and adding a little bit of value, some contrast, to have some touches of it to help balance out my composition. So now I'm back to normal speed here, and I've done a lot of brush work there, starting to describe the leaves, give the feeling that these leaves are just kind of hanging down out of this massive leaves, out of this foliage that's on the pepper plants. And you can see that I'm mixing a much darker color there. I have some rose madder, I have some royal blue, I have some quinacridone gold. What I'm looking for is just kind of a dark, earthy color that I'm going to put in this kind of shadowed area. But I'm going to have some cool colors, some variation of cool colors going on also. See, I already have a blue tone there. So I'm just taking this value down a little bit in this area here. This is where it's going to be the greatest area of contrast. It's a kind of a larger dark shape, and it's right against that white pot. I'm going to carry that value a little bit more to the left, and at some point I'm going to take a little bit of that to the right side, and there's a shape up there that's kind of part of a window. That's an angular corner, and I'm going to put in a darker value there, but you'll see that when I put that in. Now I'm bringing this value on the other side of the pot. I'm continuing to bring that warm glaze down right to the edge of the wall. Now I want to bring a little of that darker value on the right side of the middle pot there, because it looks kind of, it doesn't look quite right to have that dark value on the left side and nothing coming through on the right side. So that's kind of how it is in the photograph, but I'm going to modify that. I'm going to carry some of that dark value behind it just to suggest that the leaves are casting a shadow there on that wall behind, but it helps connect that dark value to the dark value on the left side of that planner. Another benefit of putting that shadow on that side there is that it helps describe the vertical plane of the wall that's behind this kind of ledge that these are sitting on. That shadow helps further describe that that's a vertical plane. Now I'm going to put some middle value washes in the top here of the planter, it doesn't make sense to have some of those whites where they're at right now. I just haven't painted those areas, so now I'm just glazing over those with a neutral, kind of a neutral gray violet. And I'm going to do the same with this third pot here on the end. When you look down inside there, it's going to be darker. But I'm not being too descriptive with that one. I'm going to do a little calligraphy here just to help define some of the structure of this container, and it's got a little hole where it drains at the bottom. Now I want to give a little bit more definition to some of those leaves or the foliage that are on this third pot to the right. And you can see if you look at my palette, I have a variety of mixtures here. It's just still using the same colors, but I have them mixed up in different ratios. And I like to, just to me, I call this setting up my palette. I like to set up the mixtures and keep them set up so that I don't have to mix them as I go. They're available. I kind of have an idea of what I'm going to use. And it's not that there's not more mixing as I do this, and some of it's mixing occurs on the paper, but I like to have a variety, and I normally have some warm and some cool tones mixed. And I tend to put the cool colors on one side of my palette and the warmer colors on the other when I mix them, and that's how I have my palette laid out. I have the cooler area colors from the color wheel on the right side and the warmer colors on the left. And here's where I'm bringing that dark that's equal or helps balance, I'll say, the darks that are on the left there behind the far left pot. There's a bit of a window that's behind the foliage here. So I'm going to describe that with a darker value and pick up some of that dark value from the left side. And I'll be using some smaller brush marks, some smaller shapes of dark value also. And then there's also an angular white shape that kind of complements that, and then helps pick up some of that pure white of the paper from down below. And now here's where I'm carrying this value across. So like I said, I'm not trying to render individual leaves so much. I'm just trying to show spatial relationships and overlapping shapes. I'm defining edges. I do it primarily by showing where edges are and where they're not. I let the edges disappear and let the viewer the viewer's eye will help complete those lost edges. But there's areas that I definitely don't have as much detail. If you look at that kind of right to the right of my hand there, above my hand right now, that large kind of light green area, I could go in there and do the same kind of brushwork that I did on the left, but then it's going to be competing with the left side, and the left side is really where I want to draw you into the kind of the bright white pots when this is done. So I don't want to have the same level of contrast and activity. I need to give some resting places even in these leaves. There's a tendency just to want to paint every little leaf somebody's going to see on this. But I'm trying to manage the level of detail and where it's at in my painting. So these are chili pepper plants, and they have a couple chili peppers hanging within all the green leaves. It just kind of peeks through, so I'm just going to give an indication of those colors coming through. I want them to be fairly bright. There's some yellows and reds, and as I mentioned earlier, the yellows and reds I have that I'm using are Hansa Yellow Light, Quinacridone Gold, Pyro Red. Those are primarily the three colors that I'm using for these peppers. And there's some areas there where I left the white of the paper so that I could come back in and put some of these little just touches of bright color. because your color is going to be it's most intense when you paint it on white paper as opposed to painting it over something you've already glazed over. So I cleaned my palette out and mixed a fresher mixture of paint here. So I have a bit of an orange tone, kind of a red orange. So I just giving a slight indication of these peppers and trying to vary the size of the shapes that I'm showing. I don't want them all to be the same. On the left there, that kind of a bright red that I have in there, you just barely see a little shape of red coming through those leaves. You don't see the whole pepper. And then on the right there, I've added a little bit more, and this one you're going to see the tip coming down. Now I've mixed some more of the kind of a gray violet here with royal blue, rose madder quinacridone, and a little bit of quinacridone gold. I'm going more towards a dark middle value. I want to strengthen the shadows that are on these containers. I want a little more contrast to help show off the white of the paper here, the brightness on this planter and down into the wall. So I'm just going to go back over these shadowed areas that I have painted with a glaze that's just a little bit darker value. I'm going to bring this darker value around the front of this planter, but I'm not going to bring it up onto the planter itself. I'm going to let that stay the tone that it is. I'm going to let this kind of contrast that and help define that this is a flat horizontal surface. And then I'm going to bring this color over the wall and bring it down to help again further describe a little stronger the vertical plane here of the wall. You can see I brought that shadow all the way across. I'm going to bring it up over this linear mark that helps describe the two planes. I'm actually going to go a little bit darker, add a little bit more blue to the mixture. It's still wet, so I'm not going to really have any issues with a blossom. And I'm going to take that a little bit darker mixture and go back up on the kind of the horizontal plane here and strengthen that even more. When the paint dries, it dries much lighter. So sometimes when you think you're about there on your value, once it's dry, you may not be as dark as you thought you were going to be. Now I'm going to take a brush here, my quill brush with a dark mixture, and just put some accents on this, just some kind of calligraphy, little calligraphic marks to help define edges and separate some shapes a little bit more we're using line. So just some little short lines, little dots, little dashes, and just little areas of contrast that help further refine certain areas, help balance value. I want to take this dark value and weave it through this plant a little bit. So there's nowhere in particular that I am being guided to put this by my reference photo. I'm just looking for junctures where shapes are coming together, where I can make an interesting little mark that would help define it a little bit more, and also at the same time help balance the values that I'm using. I'm going to work in some more of this in a few areas here where I want some more contrast than this left side. you can see that there's much more detail in the area that I'm working, much more contrast, much more hard edge in that area than there is to the right, where the third plane to the right is. I've left that just a suggestion of what's going on, but nowhere near the same level of detail as what I have to the left, and that's intentional. I'm going to go back to this area here on the wall and put some touches of paint. I want to strengthen that suggestion a little bit more, that suggestion of a vertical plane. So I'm just putting some color there, some warm tones, taking my spray bottle and just letting that go vertically down my page. It's going to be just enough to strengthen that suggestion, but it's not going to overpower that light shape. Now I'm going to put a mat on this to get rid of the tape and get a good look at the artwork. And there you have my painting, Pepper Pots. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the Learning Center on my webpage, where you'll find information about my YouTube videos, my self-study courses, and my live online classes and workshops. Just click on the link.